I'm Geoffrey Staton. I was born in Leek in 1940. I went to work in the factories in 1955. I left Leek on the 6th of January 1980 and I've not been back to Leek, but I came back to Chilton in 1972 to be the vicar of Chilton. I was the rural dean of Leek for a short period. I'm retired and live in a place called the Haywoods near Stafford, which is a very pleasant area to live. And I'm an itinerant preacher and I have a great life. And I live Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday and Sunday now. I found myself at the age of 15 looking for work because I had to leave the school. And I had 3 jobs on offer. I could have worked on the parks. My mother wanted me very much to go in to become a solicitor's clerk. And my Sunday school superintendent said, what about being an apprentice dyer? And I said to him, Mr. Butterworth, that seems exciting. So I became an apprentice dyer at Clues & Sons, Brook Street, which is in the middle of the town. And in those days, there was something around, well over 20 to 30 dyeworks. Today, there were probably 3. And the massive ones were at Leek Brook, just down the road from here, Joshua Wardle's. Then Thomas and Arthur Wardle's were down at the Churnit, near where Leek football ground is today. And they were big, and they had their own massive dyeworks. They not only dyed the materials, the cloth, they made the cloth, and they sold the cloth, and they sold the yarns. We were called a commission dyer, and that meant all the stuff in our warehouse did not belong to the company. It belonged to the companies we dyed for. So I began work being trained as a pure silk dyer, and it was in a little pot of boiling water with silk in it, and I learned how to put the dye into the pot, put the white silk into the dye and get it to the right shade, and you had to do it with so many dips, because if the silk was too long, it became brittle. So really and truly you had 3 goes to get it on shade, and it took a while. Then I went off to be the cotton, out to the cotton department, and I was taught how to dye cotton, and that was mostly on machines, massive machines. And whereas I used pots, like an artist's palette for the dyeing of silk, the pure silk, I had a palette, and on this palette were many shades, oranges, greens, blues, and everything. And I used to choose a bit of this and a bit of the other, and drop it in, and you get what we call, you lift the liquor up like that, and you look, and as you look at the liquor, you can tell how it's going to dye. And that's the skill, it's having the eye. But everybody has a different eye. Some people have red eyes, some people have green eyes. And if you're a red eye man and you're working for a company, like I was for Worthington's, the man there was a pain because I had a green eye and he had a red eye. So we would never agree on a shade because we just were different, a different view of the shade. And in the end, we always had to go to a third party to give it the nod because as it was their material, we couldn't pass it ourselves. Everything had to be passed. And people used to be walking through the streets with a hank of silk on their hand, going to a firm up the road for someone to pass the colour. And then it was made up. Well, it left us usually in the yarn state, on bottle bobbins or on cone bobbins. And then it was made up into cloth, like royal robes. We did, at the beginning, I know we did, in the beginning of my career, we were doing a number of important purple robes, and the secret in dyeing was always, was it fast to light and was it fast to washing, i.e., and you put it in the light for any length of time, did the shade disappear? Or if you washed it in too hot a water, did the shade disappear? And the 2 great colours were black and white. Now they were and there were secret recipes in every dyeworks for the blacks. We called ours Reverend, and it was passed down by word of mouth. And I never was given it because I left at the age of 20 and deserted the company to become a clergyman. But up to the age of 20, I was learning all about the textile trade. And the reason why my company lost its way was because the owners would only dye man-made natural fibres. They wouldn't dye man-made fibres. Though they did a bit of terylene, particularly during the war, for parachute belts and things like that, but they weren't keen on that. The company boasted on doing wool and silk and cotton, and that's what we were famous for and noted for. I think it was simply because nobody had a perfect recipe to make one fast to light and fast to boiling water. In fact, it was new chemicals in the end that we put in the water that saved the day. When I first started at Clews & Sons Brook Street, the labourers had to strip off to the waist and hold the hanks of black dye like that and beat it on a stone to get rid of all the loose dye before it was dried and sent out to be made out. The river churned water was soft to light, it's soft, so it allowed the dye stuff to go gently onto the materials. And that's what you needed. You didn't need a harsh water, you needed a gentle water. And the churn provided, i.e. the Churn Works was one of the earliest ones, down in Mill Street at the bottom end of the town. And there was lots of, all the big firms had a small Dyeworks. At Upper Hume there was a massive Dyeworks, and they were using the Churn right up there before it even got to Leek. And then on the other side was at Leek Brook coming out this way. You passed it as all houses now. But in fact, my wife came to Leek Brook to be their designer. And I met her because by then I was the vicar of Cheddleton and we fell in love when we married. Well, in Life in the Town, there were people like Lux, which was that did all the blouses and skirts and naughty negligees for Marks and Spencer's. There was Brough, Nicholson and Hall that were very big in corsets. And a good friend of mine used to do laces, dye laces for corsets. And he spent his whole life dyeing laces for corsets. And your whole life was built around it. The chairman of the council was usually one of the mill owners at this stage, though a very powerful chairman was the Fruiter Fallon, but he was a break from the tradition a bit. But the Lady Nicholson and John Nicholson and all these leading families were the leading owners of the mills. And where I was in Brook Street, round the corner was Donald Cope's, Watson's and Worthington's, and you just could walk round the corner and there they were. It was a great thing to get an order. If Donald Cope came, in fact, Donald Cope's company kept our company going because they did massive work on school blazers, school caps, and we dyed the wool to make the caps and the blazers. Once again, we had terrible trouble with red, because getting red fast to light and fast to water is very difficult. And you see, the dear lady would put it in a washing machine, and when they invented washing machines, all of a sudden that you could turn the temperature up, suddenly the liquor coming out went pink, and they couldn't understand why, because they'd not hand washed the jumper. We had to write, in the early days, you used to write on the thing going out, please wash by hand. And because once washing machines came, and dolly mixers were a bit of a nightmare to us, but washing machines were really a step too far. Well, yes, the days were, I started my day at 6:45 and I finished at 5:45. That was the day. And you had 10 minutes in the morning break and then 3/4 an hour for lunch. They worked long hours and the pay was appalling, really. I mean, I think I started on £2, 10 shillings and threepence per week. A manager might be getting £14, 10 shillings. You see, what people don't realise, every May, all the family members came to the Dyeworks and it was payout time for the directors because it was how it worked. The town was all based around textiles. The centre of the town was the textiles paid for the food. Then there gently came engineering, very slowly. Two great engineering firms. One was Bode's of Leek, and they then started causing ripples on the pond of wages and conditions. I never knew Leek to strike on any matter with regard to textiles. Never. Mr. Lyle, the union representative, was so kind to the bosses, it was unbelievable, you know. But I was very early on in what we call the boss's side, because as an apprentice I was going to be management. But it was hard being a worker because the conditions were not very pleasant. They couldn't leave the dyeworks, and if you can imagine gallons of boiling water flushing around your feet and you're standing on a duckboard and the dye and the fumes coming up at you all day. So you weren't allowed to have a fag. You'd try to go off for a fag, but the managers were there on your back if you did disappear. And life was pretty tough. And then at the end of the day, and I did have to share this with them as an apprentice, you had to take all the material you dyed, wool, silk, cotton, and take it to the ovens. And in the ovens, that's where it dried overnight. But the ovens were red hot. So you went in and you did it. So to this day, I'm never hot, but I'm often very cold because my body adjusted at the early, because I was 15 to 20 years of age then. My body adjusted to enormous heat and boiling water coming up on the duckboard. That's why we wore clogs. We wore wooden clogs because we'd have foot rot if we'd wore rubber.
Wow.
So, and if you fell down between the machine, it's good night, Mr. Chips. I know one man fell and I had to jump in and hold his head together while they put stitches in him, but that was rare because health and safety was not high on the agenda. I never forget one of the most interesting moments in my life in the factory was when time and motion came in, a time and motion study of every job in the factory. And this man he had a white coat on and a little board. We all thought it was rather, the men all cried, ice cream, he's selling ice cream. But he wasn't, he was testing and seeing. And after I came of that, after weeks and weeks, even months of watching men work, it came into being that we bought canvas trucks in. Not trucks made with steel on either side, but with canvas bags. Because it was easier to load the stuffs, put the canvas inside the whizzes. Because when they came, if you can imagine a massive machine as big as this room, filled with wool, lowered into the dye. Now you had to get them done in 2 dips because wool was very delicate. And if you look at wool under a microscope, it's like broken shell pots all in a row. So if you overboil it or put too much bleach in when you're doing the whites or anything like that, you damage the fibres, so that when the ladies upstairs, that's the other job I did, was to take work up to the ladies in the bottle bobbing room, and they were on piecework time rate, and they were paid an extra threepence per day if they got through a good quantity of work. Now if you gave them some wool that was a bit brittle, it kept breaking, so they couldn't get the bottle bobbins full fast enough. And in fact, in the Dyeworks, generally speaking, it was the bonus schemes that gave you a living wage. The actual living wage wasn't up to much. Well, the centre of industry was the textile industry. It was a textile town. In many ways, it was a dying town. It hasn't died quite off, but you know, it was that's what it was known for. It was known for its silk mills. Then it had a massive paper mill out at Cheriton, and but it was, generally speaking, it was all to do with textiles. If I'm basically honest, I did not like what I was doing. I was not a happy bunny. And I was looking, I learned early on, through the church mostly, that if I was ever to be really happy, I'd got to leave Leek and strike out and do something else. Well, it was awfully boring after a bit. I mean, if you know, dyeing black for 3 days and then doing a few colours and then giving the work out. And the first thing I used to do every morning was go put the steam into the dyeworks. That is the noisiest moment in the life of a dyeworks, because all these big vats have to be warmed up. So you turn great big wheels and the steam goes in as it goes in. The noise is phenomenal. And all the men threw bits and bobs at me because they were all having a nice fag and a cup of tea. And suddenly this noisy little brighter, I turned it on, and once that was turned on, the water started boiling. Then people had to work. People worked very hard in some pretty tough, awful conditions. Well, they all had a boiler house, and in the boiler house there was, in ours it was a big coke boiler, and they just threw it on. That provided all the heat. And then the water came directly through the town, I imagine taken from the reservoirs of churnic water which were placed around the town. In fact, we were all drinking churnic water for the most part, I would imagine. Well, you could go to, it wasn't strict, but that's where you go. Certain pubs were noted for certain things. Cribbage was a great, card playing was a great, and my father was the singing barman at the Red Lion in the main square in Leek. Oh yes, the town was a coal, it's coal burning town. Everybody had coal fires. We didn't have the fogs. They always used to mystify us about the fogs in London because we didn't have fogs in Leek. But I do remember accumulators. If you had a radio, you had to go down to and get an accumulator to fasten onto your crystal set to have the radio on. And then we were relatively poor, so we couldn't afford coal. So I used to have to go with an old pram and get 2 bags of coke from the gasworks and bring it up every Saturday. Coke is coal with all the coal taken out. So it's just a shell of coal. It's just like a cinder. Coke is like a cinder. You put it on and it warms up, but it hasn't got anything like the heat of coal. Oh, we had a little bit of coal. You had to have a bit of coal to warm the coke up. But you couldn't have a big, beautiful, big coal fire. That's why I like going to the vicarage, because the vicar could afford coal. And he had a coal scuttle, and I'd never seen one of those before. I spent a lot of time in the countryside because the youth club, which I joined to, was the church youth club, and the vicar used to take us walking at bank holidays and Boxing Day, and I used to say I died all week and lived on Sundays because I was in the factory till Monday to Saturday morning, normally till lunchtime, and then I was free then, and church was attractive because no other youth club, there was nowhere else to go where you found beautiful girls and wonderful jelly and ice cream and things nice like that. Yes, that's where it all happened. Well,
into the river?
we didn't know about pollution. We just didn't know about pollution. And we never thought about it. I can tell you, I used to play a great deal as a child in the Churnet, just at the bottom of Borley Green. You used to just go over the field, and at the bottom there was the Churnet flowing free. And my mother used to take us, because I'm one of 14 children, and they wanted perfection. I was the last. And we used to swim and go down with bread and jam and bottles of water, and that was our treat. And then my brother was a very keen fisherman, freshwater fisherman, and we used to go to the Titisworth Pool, which is now a massive reservoir. And we used to sit there with our baiting little worm and maggots, fish away all day. So the Churnet, that area was a playground for us. And yes, the Churnet was very important. Everybody went down to the Churnet. The only other treat was to go on a train from Leek to Rudyard and to go to the lake. But that was left mostly for the toffs. The working classes didn't normally get down to Rudyard until the late 1960s. There was no obvious sign of colour, because the dye colour disintegrated very quickly, because it was weighty, it went down. But there was a foam. There's a lot of foam about. If you went down, certainly down to Low Amel and that vicinity, the bottom of that area, there was nasty foam. Well, I think the thing is, it's just changed. People have just changed their works. People entered electrical companies, engineering companies, the hotel trade. It's just different. I think I'm right in saying that Leek's population has not changed dramatically for the last 40 or 50 years. In my day, it was around 19-20,000, and I do believe that's what it is today. The other thing I should say, it was very enlightened, the apprenticeship, because I had one day a week when I went to the Leek College of Further Education, and I did the Sitting Guilds examinations in dyeing and knitting and weaving. Not that it interested me a great deal, it was just a thing I had to go to, part of the apprenticeship. And you qualify, your apprenticeship was over at 18. And so I worked as an assistant manager in the Dyeworks for 2 years. And then I went and gave my notice. And my boss, Mr. Clue, said to me, "You're a bit of a fool to leave this. You're made if you stay with this company. But if you've got religion, what can I do about it?" And so I said, "I'm off." So I went off. But they were very good. They bought me a silk dressing gown to go away with. And they gave me £5 worth of premium bonds. So those were the days of great bounty. And the whole way of life has gone. I mean, all the pubs had their own darts teams, which were all from the Dyeworks. My brother, the Dyer's Arm at the bottom, you probably saw the pub called the Dyer's Arms. Well, the Dyer's Arms was where my brother was darts champion. I never drank because I couldn't stand beer. That was due to the fact that my brothers drank beer and shared a bedroom with me from when I was 12 and even before. So I couldn't stand the smell of beer. I've always been a wine and champagne man as a result of this. But it wasn't very readily at 11 Fimpston Place on the council estate, wine and champagne. I had to get to that through Holy Mother Church. Well, I think in many ways it's changed for the better. I mean, nobody's working in the conditions that the textile workers were working, but that's true in every industry. So it's changed, I think, for there's a lot of nice things in Leek now. I mean, it's a little bit like some of the little areas in London, so many little coffee houses and this wonderful creation called a charity shop. We'd have loved a charity shop. I could have bought such wonderful gear if there'd have been charity shops. There weren't even charity shops in those days, you see. Oh yes, I must admit, I felt always that I was part of the life in Leek. And you learn, I mean, I was particularly probably observant of it because I saw my own mill family, the Cluse family, were a very generous family. Mr. Cluse, Major John he was called because he was in the First World War. Major John used to be very philanthropic, is it called? Philanthropic to us. He could be very, very kind. He could be pretty, you had to work. There's no, I never forget if he was upset with you, he used to say, take off your clogs and get off my bonk. His bank, you know, get off my factory. But you see, people could be sacked very easily. Yeah. And people needed money. There were lots of poor families in Leek. But we didn't notice the poverty. If you'd have said to me, did you know you were poor? I only know now, looking back, I was poor. Because all the people in Filmston Place were poor. We all just had bread and jam, and one of our main meals per week was oxo and toast. Now, but everybody had oxo and toast. And the great luxury was on Fridays, we had fish and chips. Well, we couldn't afford it now, 1 and 3pence it was in those days. But, you know, it was just, well, you accepted it, especially just after the war and the 50s. People were very, there was no money around. All my clothes were bought from tallymen who came to the door selling clothes, penny a week, you know. That's why I never live like that now, you know. I always have hidden away in my wallet a £20 note because I can't bear the thought of not having any money. And I'm a man who should trust and obey, but I have to have a little bit of backup.